Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session in IMC 2020. This panel is regarding 5G policies and spectrum and regulatory policies impacting the mobile revolution in India. The government has a key role to play in the telecom industry's progress, particularly in defining policy and regulation. Considering the infrastructural challenges in India, the role of the government becomes all the more critical in enabling the transition from 3/4G to 5G technology. Spectrum acquisition costs need to be affordable for telecom players, not only because it causes undue financial stress to the telcos, but has a cascading effect on the cost to the consumers. Also, it would be critical to provide support in the form of quicker right-of-way permits, single-way window clearances, time-bound permit decisions, reduced fee structures, and well-defined guidelines on infrastructure sharing, use of street infrastructure, etc. The government could also incentivize the movement towards 5G through a slew of measures, which obviously we need to debate upon. Some of the key questions that really come up as we embark on this is that as India is still some time away from the 5G rollout relating to spectrum auction, rollout protocols, and on-the-ground use case testing, how can 5G implementation process gain momentum? 5G needs a significant amount of harmonized mobile spectrum in contiguous blocks for realizing the true potential use cases of the technology and for global interoperability. What can help in achieving these objectives, and how can, in India, we get close to these global standards? How do we keep the high or expected to be high 5G spectrum prices limited without really limiting the network investment and driving up the cost of services and adding to the already stressed telecom sector, and what is and can be done to ensure that doesn't happen? Lastly, key imperatives of regulation or policy reform relating to enabling infrastructure to ensure speedier deployment and 5G adoption. For this, we have an august panel to deliberate on these aspects. So let me briefly introduce you to these 6 panelists for this session. First up, we have Alan Norman. Alan is the Public Policy Director at Facebook and actively supports Facebook's spectrum and connectivity initiatives. Alan is a long-time advocate for improved broadband and internet access, shared infrastructure, and spectrum for next-gen technologies. Recently, Alan has actively been engaged on rural access, Wi-Fi, mmWave, and 5G. We have Amit Kushwaha. Amit is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Bharti Airtel Limited. He has over 19 years of experience in telecom. He's an expert on public policy, strategy, regulatory operations, and compliance. His experience includes working with the Department of Telecom for more than 8 years. So that will be important to actually help see how we can balance both the regulatory aspects of it as well as how telecom operators look at regulation. Then we have Sundeep Kathuria. Sundeep is the Executive Vice President in Policies and Regulation and Regulatory Affairs at Vodafone India. He has more than 20 years of experience in the Indian telecom industry in various areas, including policy and regulatory affairs. We have Subrata Kumar Mitra. He's the Vice President and Head Government and Industry Relations at Ericsson India. Next up, we have Vishakha. Vishakha is the VP and Head of Strategic Initiatives and Regulatory Policy and Research at Reliance Jio. Her areas of expertise include strategy, market assessment, regulatory due diligence, performance investment, cost optimization, amongst others. And then, last but not the least, we have Colonel Bharat Gupta. Bharat is the Head of Corporate Affairs at Sterlite Technologies Limited. He commissioned in June 1994 in the Corps of Signals. He has more than 26 years of experience in telecom regulatory policy and ICT. His focus areas are in spectrum management, policy and regulatory, data privacy. Let me bring in Subrata first. May I, Subrata, request your indulgence first You represent an OEM that's heavily embedded in the genesis of the technology and in evolving the ecosystem. Given these circumstances, what do you see as critical in terms of network architecture, planning, or infrastructure, and how spectrum plays its part amongst all these?
Thanks, Shobhit. Uh, Globally, what we have seen is that countries which have decided on the spectrum strategy are the ones who have moved ahead on 5G. And the one imperative very clear is that we need to have a clarity on the amount of spectrum. Spectrum needs to be contiguous. Spectrum needs to be without any hindrance, encumbrance. There should not be any geographical or power restrictions of any nature. And that's the prerequisite for a robust 5G rollout. And when I'm talking about spectrum, it is spectrum across the core 3.5 gigahertz in the millimeter wave band 26 or 28 and the critical backhaul. And I think these three issues need to be resolved. And if I get into the nitty-gritties, then at the 3.5 gigahertz, globally, what we are requesting regulators and the government is to give a minimum of 100 megahertz per operator, make available of at least 100 megahertz per operator in 3.5, at least 400 megahertz in the millimeter wave band, which is 26, 28, and depending on the E-band, sufficient amount of backhaul. I think this is extremely critical for us to first solve it, and then we can then plan the next stage. Uh, and coming back to your question on why this is critical is that see your entire network planning, your equipment planning, availability, your network, your design architecture is all dependent on the spectrum band that you are going to get, the amount of spectrum that you are going to buy. Now, while we understand the spectrum has to be picked up in an auction in India, but at least the availability needs to be assured that before the auction begins, the operators should know that yes, there is sufficient amount of spectrum, and with that we can do the planning. Just to give you an example, if there is no clarity in terms of whether you will get 50 megahertz or 60 megahertz, or you'll actually end up with 100 megahertz, then your network planning, architecture, and all that can only start after you get that quantity. Hence, the spectrum is the first piece of the jigsaw puzzle which we need to solve.
Thank you, Shobhit. I think there are absolutely no two ways about the fact that India needs to embark on the 5G journey without any further delays. Given the tremendous potential of 5G and the multiplier effect it can have on the overall economy, immediate and concerted efforts are needed to propel India on the 5G path. First and foremost, it is critical to kickstart the 5G trials at the earliest. Without any further delays, the government should come up with a clear framework and the guidelines for these trials and make necessary provisions to allocate trial spectrum to the telcos across various bands on priority. And while doing so, it is important that the framework and the conditions, they give adequate amount of flexibility to the TSPs and their partners to test various nuances of the technology without any bottleneck or administrative hurdles. Secondly, to encourage long-term investment in 5G networks and to ensure that 5G growth happens in the true sense, it's imperative to have transparent and unambiguous spectrum policy with a clearly defined roadmap of available spectrum over a horizon of at least a 4 to 5 year. And we all understand that in 5G we need to balance the capacity and the coverage needs and support varied use cases, and that is why all the bands are important. So we need a mix of bands, whether it's the mid band, low bands, or the high speed millimeter wave band. Thus the roadmap should include clear allocation plan for each of these bands. Thirdly, adequate spectrum is very important. Unfortunately, smaller fragmented blocks of spectrum is not going to help. And like my fellow panelists said, when we talk about the prime mid band, which the government has identified for 5G, the current allocated spectrum block is very, very less. And we need at least a 80 to 100 megahertz of contiguous spectrum per operator for successful rollout of 5G. And similarly, higher quantums of spectrum for other bands as well. Needless to say, the prices have to be affordable. Currently, the prescribed reserve prices are grossly inflated, and they can seriously impair the ability of the industry and the telecom providers to invest in the much needed infrastructure. Finally, spectrum in E and B band is going to be very critical for 5G backhaul in India, and it needs to be allocated on priority through a fair auction-based process. To sum up, I'll just stress on the fact that the pace at which India embraces 5G, it's going to determine the trajectory of growth across all sectors, whether it's healthcare, agriculture, education, retail, and so on. So the sooner we come out with the right policy roadmap and the plan to address the impediments, the better will be the gains for the nation. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Vishakha. That was, that really brings out some of the key imperatives that obviously are important to us. Let me bring in our next speaker. That's Amit. Amit, how would you respond to some of the challenges that we are seeing, and where do you see that, you know, policy initiatives or improvement in policy initiatives plus a clear regulation can actually build for your comments. I think, Amit, if I can just bring you in and understand from you, what do you feel will be the key imperatives at this point of time and juncture in the entire regulatory space when we're considering introductions of 5G in India?
Yeah, thanks, Shobhit. Uh, thanks, Shobhit. Uh, I echo the view put forward by Subrata and Vishakha. I think India is a unique country in terms of its challenges as well as opportunities. If we see that the kind of uh, population or the kind of density that is required and kind of a sparse geography that we are faced with unique challenges. I think we need to see it from that lenses, and we need to embark upon the 5G trial at the earliest. So I think from an initiative to actually launch 5G, I think the 5G trial is a must, and we should start building up the ecosystem and the use cases which are unique to India, because that is what will determine the ROI on investments that happen by 5G. I think for 5G trials, the spectrum needs to be allocated for a full 1 year period, and due relaxations as required in terms of import licenses and addition of OEMs or equipment or sites may be allowed by the DoT. Having said this, we cannot uh, uh, neglect the requirement of a harmonized spectrum and standards. I believe harmonized spectrum is required because the globally the equipment that is procured is working in all the bands, and it's required for international roaming and all other interoperability. So I think the first and foremost requirement should be having a harmonized spectrum, which is aligned with the WRC 19. So that should be assigned and reserved for allocation for 5G. The other is the standards. I believe we should be using the 3GPP standards or the globally adopted standards so that all the interoperability is effective too. Other than this, I think my fellow panelist Vishakha emphasized on the need to have adequate spectrum, and adequate spectrum is definitely required. And it is not only in the sub gigahertz band, but also in the mid 1 to 6 gigahertz band and the greater than 6 gigahertz band, because all have different utility. Because if I can say that 5G has use cases which are related to EMBB, which is the enhanced mobile broadband, or the FWA, as well as it has great utility in terms of uh, MMTC and URLLC. I think ultra reliable low latency. So I think each band plays a very important role, and without a specific band, the operator might not be able to launch some of the use cases. Having said this, I think spectrum is really required at an affordable price, and the prices needs to be revised. And for 4G to take place, I think all these impediments needs to be removed, and we need to go forward for the journey. Thanks.
Thanks, Amit. I think you gave a good summary of some of the key things. I think all of these can come together and need to come together for this to be an effective implementation, and that's what's going to be key as we really move forward in that. So let me switch gears here, and Alan, may I request your indulgence at this point of time? I think you are in a very different position. Most of the people, when they are talking about regulations, etc., they focus either on the regulator or they try and focus on the network providers or on the service providers. I think you straddle somewhere in between, if I may, and obviously look forward to your comments, seeing that some of the challenges that we have in India, but also reflecting on what we have learned from some of the test cases that 5G is undergoing across the world. And how do you see that really playing out for Facebook?
Well, thank you very much, and appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel. And thanks to COAI and all the other panelists. Facebook relies very heavily, and Facebook users rely very heavily on wireless connectivity. In India, over 300 million users are on Facebook. And as such, we're really looking forward to and very supportive of seeing a successful 5G deployment in India, and are actively engaged. Given all the challenges everyone's mentioned, and we've seen these same challenges elsewhere in the world, we really think that a diversity of approaches are going to be required to be successful. First, though, spectrum abundance is going to be essential. Wholeheartedly agree with everyone's statements that low band, mid band, high band, millimeter wave are all going to be essential, and having enough so that no one is constrained and can really deploy in a way that's effective. So we're strongly advocating for that to make sure that there's enough spectrum for everybody. The second is that there's going to be different approaches required for different deployments. In rural, where you have challenges of coverage and less disposable income, sharing will be important. In urban, where you're going to have huge challenges for capacity, you're going to have to take different approaches where you might have much denser deployments. So we think that flexibility in the licensing is also important, so that different approaches can be taken, different participants can contribute to making the overall system available to everybody. And then the third point, and this is perhaps a little more controversial, but I really don't think so, and that is we think there's going to need to be a balance of both licensed and unlicensed spectrum. That in fact, Wi-Fi and other ultra-wideband and other unlicensed technologies are going to have a big contribution to the overall 5G experience, and that it's important for both in the home, in the office, but also on the person for wearable devices and things like that, to have these complementary devices and services available to complement what's happening with 5G. So you'll see us actively working in India to help facilitate many of those different approaches that I just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was saying you brought up a very relevant point, Alan, and thanks for highlighting that between how do we really balance between the licensed and the unlicensed spectrum in a country like India. This is going to be very, very relevant as such, and how you need to split your approach between what is going to be an urban implementation and what will be a rural implementation. We know that the usage of data at the rural levels is actually shooting, and that is going to be a very important part of the strategy from a social aspect for the government, rather than only from commercialization of the entire technology. Okay, so thanks for that. Those are very apt comments, Alan. Let me request Sundeep to come on. Sundeep, you from Vodafone Idea, obviously you are among the trio, the largest of the operators. You manage almost 300 million subscribers. 5G has its own, as we say, there are no killer apps that have been propounded as of now under 5G. But what would you see as the key things to really push this engine and accelerate forward?
Thank you, Shobhit. I think valid points have been made on the spectrum, on the availability and the price part. So I will not dwell on that. and these are very essential, issues which need to be resolved for India to really leapfrog in 5G. However, at this stage, there are other factors also which are really critical for the 5G rollouts. First of all is the infra part also is very, very critical in this whole sphere. Today, in India, for example, we have got around 30% towers which are fiberized. In countries like US or China, it is around 80 to 90% fiberization is there. So the backhaul is a major issue on 5G, and there is a real need for fiberizing all the towers ASAP. So while we are preparing for other things, I think the effort should be made to fiberize the towers. The policy is there at the central level. However, the implementation is really lacking in India. There are state bodies, municipalities, RWAs, all play their different roles. The cost of laying is very high, time taken is very high. So on that front, we really need to work very, very hard, because even if we have excess spectrum, if we don't have fiber, the 5G dream will not be fulfilled. At the same time, today we are having different technologies, 2G, 3G, 4G, maybe 3G will be outgoing in some time, but add on 5G to it. So at the tower level, we will face, issues of additional power required. Also, the network here will be more dense compared to 2G, 3G, 4G. Therefore, reliability of electricity is very, very important. And that kind of infra is very much required for the 5G. Apart from that, there are other issues clearly touching upon the business case. Spectrum part you discussed. India is a very, in a different sphere altogether, where the number of users are very, very high. Just now figure given was 300 million for Facebook. Overall, we have got around 650 million people using smartphones. The usage per subscriber is also very high in India, 11 GBs. So high number of users, usage being very, very high. And then we see that spectrum is less compared to the spectrum allocations made worldwide. Our allocation is around 25%. So we have got 1/4 of the spectrum which needs to be allocated. Therefore, our network layout is very, very high. The capex is very, very high there compared to other countries. And on top of it, our ARPUs are the lowest in the world. So therefore, the equation is not coming out very clearly. There are, huge variances. So these need to be ironed out somehow. And there is, a request being made that there has to be something to be done on pricing at the regulatory level, which is very, very essential. Because ultimately, if country has to, have 5G and thrive on 5G, at least the business case of operators need to be sustainable. So that's another factor which I would like to highlight. So that's it from my side as of now. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandeep. Very relevant. In fact, this was some things that we have been contemplating or discussing at length. That considering the output or throughput that you expect from 5G, how really will the backend infrastructure hold on or support that kind of throughput? Fiberization is going to be important, and considering that in 5G you need far more densification of network, there are going to be more points of presence from a microcells perspective. You will need what you mentioned, reliability of power is going to be an extremely important thing. While from a country perspective, at least the macro stats are such that we are no longer power deficit. But the fact is that if you were to go out and ask for a connection, you know exactly how you struggle at times in certain localities. I'm not saying everywhere. In some cases, some states are fairly well endowed. In some cases, we still face those issues. And really, it's not only at the global level, it's more at the local level, where all of these impacts will really be the weakest links in the entire chain. So thanks for those comments, Sandeep. Bharat, last but not the least, if I may, thank you so much for being patient and holding on. in this entire group, again, you are again a separate call out, like Alan was mentioning. You are part of some part of the ecosystem. You are an enabler in a large sorts. I know that STL is a very big player in fiber laying, etc. What would be your thoughts in because you really support all of the MNOs, you will be also looking at government in terms of what policy perspectives they have. How do you approach this entire subject? You've been through the entire spectrum for the last 25 years. So what are your comments on this, please?
Shobhit, and I would like to thank COAI also for giving us this opportunity of speaking on this very relevant topic of 5G spectrum and the policy related issues. See, I have a couple of things in my mind when I think of 5G rollout in the country. Be it in terms of, we need to think in terms of infrastructure other than the spectrum part of it. Then we need to look at the technology standards and also the India specific use cases. While the government and the private sector has done a lot in the entire telecom revolution in the country from the 1990s, and but there is a lot which still needs to be done, and there is a lot of ground which has to be covered. Now, to begin with, I would just briefly summarize my point of view in two domains. One is related to fiberization, and I quite echo what Sundeep has just mentioned, because fiberization is going to be the key issue or the key enabler for 5G, any sensible 5G deployment in the country. Because you see, when you talk about 5G, you talk about very dense densification, and when you have a lot of densification, there would be a requirement of converting the street furniture into the radiating elements. And if at all you have to do that, there is definitely going to be a massive fiberization effort, which would be required. Now, this particular aspect has also been highlighted by Sandeep when he said that almost about when we look at India, it's about 25 to 30% of the tower fiberization which is at the moment, and which is it's abysmally low. Incidentally, the National Digital Communication Policy 2018 and also the National Infrastructure Pipeline document, which came out from the Ministry of Economic Affairs, does lay a lot of emphasis on this aspect. Wherein, if you look at the document, it says that there would be a requirement of at least laying 7.5 million fiber kilometers in the country, and that's huge. And with the ongoing, tussles and the manner in which the right of way rules are, and the positions which the various RWAs, the municipal corporations, etc., take, it is very difficult to actually do a proper deployment, and that too in a time-bound manner. So yes, a lot of reforms need to be done when you look at the fiberization part is concerned. Now, coming to the spectrum part of it, as it has been brought out by a lot of our panelists, that there is a need for harmonization of the spectrum, and be it in the 26 gigahertz band, or the 28, the 40 gigahertz band, or the 66 gigahertz band. The second point is related to the price discovery. I mean, the present mechanism of using the basis of the previous auction for determining the price of the spectrum as on date, I think that needs to be revisited if we want to actually have any availability of the spectrum for the TSPs, because at least 80 to 100 megahertz of the spectrum will be required per TSP when you're looking at the bands which are not in the millimetric wave. And when you look at the millimetric wave, the requirement may go up to 1 gigahertz. So that's huge, and we definitely need to move fast and move in harmonization or in unison of what is happening in the world over. So WRC 23 is going to be very, very important when we look at India, and India needs to position itself very well in the WRC 23 so that the aspirations of our people are met. And lastly, I would like to just emphasize on one thing, that on one side we are talking about the fiberization, but yes, that's our assessment that the next requirement of data will come from the enterprise networks, and the requirement from the users, although it is going to be high, but it is the enterprise networks which would determine the use cases for 5G. These are a couple of points which come to my mind when I think of the 5G ecosystem, the spectrum, and I would like to just stay put here, and that's about it from my side.
Thanks, Bharat. Some very relevant points, and in fact, the last one that you raised, that recalls, considering the COVID situation that we've had, one of the big problems that most of the telco networks have faced, and I'm sure all who are present, some of them will call out. The fact is that there's been a very hard task of rebalancing the kind of traffic that we've faced. Earlier the assumption used to be that during peak times the enterprise backbone would be relatively heavy, but with work from home policy, a lot of that network, which was never built in that manner, has actually shifted to the homes, right? And where overnight we've seen 40% jumps on an average across the networks around the world in terms of what traffic is being consumed. So that is again a very important factor, and therefore if you were trying to prioritize your capital today, it's a more difficult task to predict where you can prioritize that capital, because both from an enterprise point of view as well as from a consumer point of view, the real requirements of backbone have actually gone up. And we know that with the spectrum availability that we have in India, it's going to be very difficult to actually balance any kind of throughput on a wireless backhaul. It in most effectively will be a fiberization. So very, very apt comments. I think I'll just go through possibly the last round of discussion, where I'll request each of you to probably pick one element out of what you said or what you feel the other speakers said, which is really going to be key, which is like the last note to take home. And in that, may I just, Vishakha, if I can probably ask you to go in first, to say that you mentioned three things. You talked about the clarity about policy, that should be a very clear roadmap, and hearing the others. What would really, if you were to prioritize one aspect of all of this as a concluding remark, what would you pick, and what would that be? At the cost of me repeating, sorry, and maybe that requires you to repeat something, but it'll be important to hear what will your final pick be in terms of emphasizing.
Thank you, Shobhit. I think it's important to understand that, as a country, the inherent inadequacies in infrastructure are there. And this makes, the economic stakes and the digital dividends of 5G way more higher for India as compared to any other country. And thus it becomes extremely, extremely critical to ensure that, the right amount of investments go in creating and advancing the underlying communication infrastructure required for 5G. And as telcos, we've been expediting our network readiness efforts for 5G and are working relentlessly to expand and advance the communication infrastructure to meet the massive growing demand that is coming from all the sectors. However, to ensure that the momentum, continues, and as an industry, we are able to further invest in advancing the infrastructure, government support and an enabling policy environment is very, very important, So just two things, from that perspective, just to end that, easing, regulatory burden, the levies and the rationalization of taxes, that can pave a way for immediate investments that need to happen in 5G networks, in densification of towers. Second is fiberization has been told by everyone, but it's absolutely very, very important, because this is fiberization is a prerequisite for success of 5G, and this entire ROW process, needs an overhaul and streamlining in case we need to accelerate 5G. So a conducive policy environment and coordinated efforts of government and industry are very important if we need to propel India on a faster path to 5G. Thank you.
Thanks much, Vishakha. Point noted. I think This is very important. It's fundamental to how we're going to really get our story going. Sundeep, can I just request your comments? I know you. What I recall is you spoke on one very important element, that the final leg of this theory or story will be the municipalities. The time and cost that it will take to actually get a large part of the street infrastructure effectively being delivered, and their approvals are a must. And the fact that there needs to be a reliable additional power being provided for the densification of network. What would you pick as the key thing from your side if you were to pick one amongst all of these?
So I think clearly, like everybody has said, it is spectrum and infra. However, I think that what we require now is to give a vision of 5G to all the stakeholders, because unless that is seen and felt by people, conversion to what we are asking is very, very difficult and time taking. So therefore, whenever we have trials and their use cases, all the stakeholders, municipal bodies, RWAs, as much people as possible should be involved, so that they see that what is the outcome of the whole thing and how it is going to benefit the society, their own constituencies. It may also result in more revenue earning for them also. So that kind of a picture has to be given, so that people realize, because after even around 25 years, still we see that there is a reluctance at the certain levels, which we find it very strange. But those guys have got their own reasons there, and I think it is high time that there should be a reconciliation, and a win-win kind of situation should be found out. So that I think that this is a chance. Unless we succeed here, I think it will be very, very difficult to achieve what we want as a country. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sandeep. Very nice. I mean, if I can pick up one principle of what you said, that all the people who are part of the entire approval chain, if they were to see the real benefits that will come, so there's some element of education that needs to be coming back to the stakeholders to say, this is what, it's not only about commercialization, it's not the fact that operators only want to make money out of this. The fact is that there is an economic theory and what kind of unseen benefits that society is going to pick up with a massive 5G proliferation. I think that thank you for that. Alan, I'll come to your point, because I think Facebook a brilliant tool of, now it's unbelievable how many people have started talking about Facebook, and with the lockdown happening, how Facebook's usage, the power of that usage was felt by as we call K to 12 in the education system, right from nursery level, so from kids right up to people who have probably never been in front of their computers, right? And yet they were interacting through with family on Facebook and various other means. How would you, or what would you think is the one key thing that you would want to pick up to help accelerate this entire ecosystem?
So I want to go back to the balance statement that I made. I really think that there are going to be two gigantic engines of growth in internet usage. One is 5G, but I also think Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi 6 particularly are going to be essential. And so a balanced policy that provides enough spectrum, an abundant amount of spectrum for both of those technologies to move forward, I think are really going to drive the most adoption, the most economic benefit, and reach the widest number of people. So I would encourage a flexible policy that supports both of those. The other thing I'd like to point out is that I don't think it is wireless versus fiber. I think it's both. And you have to think about it systemically, that you may start out with wireless, but over time you migrate to fiber, and the two help each other accelerate the overall deployment, because you get certainty around customer usage, uptake, and capacity. So I think that's also important here as we look forward to that.
Thanks, Alan. And
Thank you.
If I had said it that way, thank you for correcting me. It's not about, very rightly said, it's not about wireless versus wireline. It's really a complementary nature. We have to see how we can balance it based on what is available, and therefore use that for the purposes of ensuring that this really is a successful venture rather than getting caught up in the bottlenecks. Bharat,
Yeah,
sorry,
thank
no,
you. So I just wanted to reiterate,
no,
the more spectrum, the better here. This is something
Alan,
we can't be
absolutely, but
starved.
somehow we've been caught in this debate. It's a quintessential debate that we've had in the subcontinent because, increasingly, I will not go into the history of it, but I guess every time we go to a new technology, this is the first question that comes up through the ecosystem. What spectrum, how much of it, and when? And will it be continuous bands? So I agree, that's a very important and a very, if I may call it, a very simple aspect that needs to be very clear, and the roadmap that Vishakha had mentioned right at the beginning needs to be put out. Bharat, can I request you to come in here? I know you mentioned the points around infrastructure and pricing is important. It's key to this entire thing. The question is that if any of these elements are very expensive, it's going to be difficult for the operators to actually deploy, right? If you start with a very heavy cost of spectrum, what will be left with the people, with the operators to actually invest in the other things? So, how do you see if you were to pull out one point to actually emphasize on, which of them would you pick?
See, I had emphasized on the requirement of massive fiberization in the country. So I would stick to that point, and I would also say that there is definitely India needs a national fiber authority of India at this moment, and there is a need for creating a national fiber grid so that we know the inventory of the fiber which has been laid, and so that the entire network can be actually to a certain extent monetized. I also agree with Alan when he has said that there is a need for having a flexibility in licensing regime. That's a very pertinent point, and we need to look at it, really pragmatically. Also, one important aspect that I did speak about was regarding the captive enterprise networks. So, captive enterprise networks are going to be game changers because it is at the mining or at the transportation that is where you're going to see a massive, real time deployment or a real life deployment of 5G, wherein you will see all the mines getting automated, the platforms getting automated, the transport system getting automated. So we need to look at the captive enterprise network also. And lastly, but not the least, we need to concentrate on the core network. And the core network, essentially, when we talk about, it is going to ride on the fiber backbone, and therefore the policies and regulations have to be made in such a manner, like Sundeep said, that the stakeholders or the end users should be incorporated to see the actual benefits what are going to be accrued. And therefore, my last point would be that yes, if we want to see a real 5G deployment in the country, we need to start with the basic infrastructure, and that would be in terms of fiberization and also the power infrastructure. So that's my submission would be, and Jayant.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you so much. Subrata, your remarks. I know you've talked about you are in a unique position because you have been part of the genesis of this entire technology, and the various constraints you're probably facing across the world. Where do you see what would you think is the most important point to pick on here?
Thanks, Shobhit. I think the speakers have all mentioned all the key areas. So one important point what I want to emphasize is that 5G, if you look at the 5G rollout globally, and if you see the nations which are rolling out, it is almost being treated as a competitive advantage game. So the nations which are rolling out early, if you look primarily all industrialized nations, nations which are very strong manufacturing base, they are rolling out for the simple reason the next generation of Industry 4.0 is going to ride on this infrastructure, and both wireline, wireless, the entire 5G. And for India now, it becomes a very pertinent question. We are now looking at trying to attract more investments into our in India and other, and we are trying to promote India as a attractive manufacturing destination, and for even other services like transportation, logistics, ports, and all. And the requirement from all those sectors will be how can you get into a digital transformation at the earliest. What we are seeing is that the new factories which are coming across the world are actually all Industry 4.0 enabled. These are all robotically connected. You're talking about complete M2M, IoT deployed right on the world book. And if you have to get those industries into India to kickstart our, to revive and give an impetus to our economy, it becomes very important that we look at 5G at the earliest. On the use cases, specifically, if you ask me, the one which we see, which is going to be extremely relevant for India, I'm not talking about the business part because business it will be industry specific and there are n number of use cases there. For the consumer, we see a very clear advantage in fixed wireless access. Fixed wireless access is actually help telecom operators to bring very high speed broadband into residential homes today. And I think COVID has explained it very clearly the criticality, the importance of high speed broadband in all our daily lives. Not merely work, our entire lives today revolve around that. And that's going to continue. This has actually changed the way we all live and consume broadband and data. And I think fixed wireless access, getting speeds up to 300 Mbps, which will be able to roll out at a very quick rate because we, as our speakers mentioned, that this is going to actually help FTTH and the growth of high-speed broadband connectivity to residences. And I think that will be for me a takeaway that we need to focus on getting 5G at the earliest. Thank you.
Thanks, Subrata. That is that is a important aspect to really consider. Amit, may I just bring you in here? What would you pick as your key recommendation or closing remark to say which is your pick in all of this, please? The last.
Thanks, Shobhit. I believe, I echo the views of all the stakeholders that spectrum, including backhaul spectrum and the fiber, is the key requirement for enabling a 5G in India. Having said this, I think we require a liberalized policy in terms of spectrum sharing, be it spectrum, be it infrastructure sharing, be in terms of spectrum or be in terms of core, and uh, even in terms of radiated power and the WPC permissions and ROW permissions. So I think that is the key. And if all this happens, I think we are right on the way ahead to 5G. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Amit. So I'll probably call this session a close. We are on the time. Really like to thank all of you for your patience and for the real insightful comments. I know there are some clear common themes that are running, and it's always difficult for six experts to talk more or less similar things, but some very, very relevant insights that have come out. And there are some micro points that are very, very important, and you can't miss, devils in the detail. So thank you again for everyone for sparing the time, investing it. Alan, thanks to you. I know it's very early morning from where you are. So thank you for being there. And again, look forward to our interactions and hoping that the 5G experiment really goes off very well and be able to accelerate. Thank you, everyone. Look forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.